It's Monday, September 27th, 1993. We're at E-Lake, and the narrator is Louisa Creed, the great-great-granddaughter of General William Jackson Palmer and Mary Lincoln Mellon Queen Palmer. We're glad that you're here to talk with us, and I think that I've just finished looking at the memorial service for your mother last year in 1992. And I think it's an extraordinary tribute to an extraordinary woman. So what I would very much like for you to do is talk to us about your mother, and maybe we can find a thread that links these very resilient, very creative, very artistic, very interesting women who are related to us in the community of Colorado Springs.
Well, my mother was, in fact, I'm afraid I will have to start with a correction, because my mother was the granddaughter of General Palmer, and therefore I'm the great-granddaughter.
Yes.
My mother was the eldest daughter of the eldest daughter of General Palmer, Elsie, whose portrait hangs in the Fine Arts Centre. And she was a very extraordinary person. She wasn't always easy to get on with, but then many mothers aren't. She was very strong, very fearless, a very domineering personality, but had her softer sides as well. She painted and designed extremely well, but for some strange reason she gave it up about 35 years ago. She died on September the 7th last year, and although once or twice people persuaded her to do a few designs or a painting or two, she never recaptured the gift that she had before. And so for a short time in her life, only about 15 years, she was very, very productive, very creative, very single-minded, and got on with a great deal of material and different techniques. And what happened was that all the stuff she did, she wasn't at all interested in publicity of any kind. All her work was just shoved into a drawer, which landed up, luckily, in my brother's apartment in London. Well, about 5 or 6 years ago, he thought, well, it's high time he explored this, what there was there. She was still alive then, of course. And he got it all catalogued, all the materials, the drawings, the designs, the paintings. And he also got my mother to talk about each thing, and he would write down verbatim what she said about it. And so her little remarks like, oh, I wasn't very pleased with that. I thought it was very dingy, that painting, or something like that. He would write that down faithfully. And so we have a record of what she did and her thoughts about her works. Well, he got it into such a good catalogue that we were able to, Lewis and I, my husband and I, were able to show this to the curator of York Art Gallery. York is where we live in England. And the curator said, well, this is clearly exhibition material. All this material that had been just buried away for all those years. So an exhibition was put on, but it didn't stop with her, because she married into a very artistic family called the Nicholsons. Now, a lot of people will have heard of Ben Nicholson. That was my father's brother. And so the exhibition consisted of my father's work. He was also an artist, though his form was architecture. And Ben Nicholson, the painter, and their sister, Nancy Nicholson, who was a textile designer and hand-printed textiles. So this was a...
And your father's name was Christopher?
Christopher, that's right. He was known as Kit. So all four of them, the exhibition was really quite an original design, because there was a room designed for each of these four designers, and it showed how they overlapped, how they cross-fertilized ideas. And there was an excellent catalogue that came of this.
I thought in the catalogue that the photograph of your mother, that she bore a remarkable resemblance to Queen. Did I want to see that, or is there some similarity in that particular photograph and the earlier ones in the structure of the face and maybe something in the attitude?
Yes, well, you may be right. I've never personally seen that, but it's such a subjective thing, this. I'm interested that you should say that you've seen a likeness. It isn't one that's generally seen, but it was no doubt there. She took after her father very much as well.
And that was Leopold Myers, was that?
Leopold Myers, yes.
Could you tell us a little about him?
He was an author, a novelist, and he wrote a lot of very obscure novels set in medieval India. He was a very good writer. He was very popular at his time, and then he sort of went into the background, and lately there's been a revival of his novels, and they've come out in paperback, and they're more widely read. But I don't think he'll ever be a bestseller, because they are very strange. I don't remember him very well. I remember my grandmother much better. He was always a figure in the background. I remember him giving me a toy called Foxy. That's about the only really clear memory I have of him, because he wasn't there very much in our childhood. And
did you hear any stories about how he met Elsie?
Well, I have to be very careful, because fact gets mixed up with imagination, and I assume certain things which may not be strictly true. But when his father died, his mother felt she needed to travel. That was her way of coming to terms with the loss of her husband. And he, at the time, was up at Cambridge. And he gave up his studies and took his mother travelling. And one of the places they travelled to was the United States and Colorado. And they had an introduction to General Palmer. And so it was at Glenari, I think, that Leopold Myers and Elsie first became acquainted. And I think they must have kept up a correspondence in the meantime. But she was over here and he was in England, and it was 10 years before they got together again and got married eventually. And that's when Elsie lived permanently in England.
They were married at Glenari then in 1908, about 1908, Elsie and Leopold. Then they returned to England, and I understand that General Palmer did have the joy and pleasure of seeing his granddaughter.
Yes. General Palmer went over to England towards the very end of his life, and we have photographs of him in the family, of him holding my mother. But it was very soon after that he died.
So she didn't come back to Glenari with her child. He
came over to.
And that was for Marjorie's wedding?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that was another trip. But I'm afraid you'll have to ask the historians these sort of questions, because I am rather vague about the chronology.
Okay.
It's all quite new to me, you see, this interest in this particular aspect. Because when we were children, we used to go every Christmas to my grandmother's. This was after the death, or a lot of it was after the death of Leo Myers. And we used to have a wonderful time, all the cousins together. That is my mother's sister's children as well. And I remember my grandmother was always there sitting in a certain chair. She didn't have very good eyesight. In fact, she was nearly blind at that time. She was quite stout and very, very feeble. She aged rather early, I think, because when I think she was in her 70s, when I think about 70-year-olds today, it's quite a different matter. She was quite feeble and needed to be led into the dining room. She had rheumatism. But she had wonderful stories about Glenari, or descriptions more than stories. She used to talk to us a lot about Glenari and the life there, and her father. She was very, very devoted to her father and talked about him very often. She was also, I'm sure, devoted to her mother, but I don't remember her talking about her so much, because she was with her mother in England a lot, and that was less spectacular to us. You know, it was more interesting to us to hear about these mountains and the dogs and the horses and the life with the servants and all, a very strange, remote life to us.
When you thought about it, did it seem like the West to you, or did you imagine it more in terms of an English countryside that you were familiar with? And then when you finally came here in '59, what surprises did you find?
Well, I had imagined it pretty clearly, really. Yes, the West. I imagined the mountains, because that's what she described, steep mountains and Pikes Peak. And also there was a picture which I can see now. It was so clearly imprinted on me. A picture by Peter Harrison, a great friend of the family's, of Major Domo, one of the rocks in the grounds of Glenari. And my grandmother was always saying, that's Major Domo. That stuck in my mind. And so I had a clear picture of those red rocks. And so when I eventually saw Glenari, and I'd seen photographs of it, it was just as I imagined. And the Garden of the Gods was what I imagined, but much more so, much more striking than I had imagined. Colorado Springs I hadn't really imagined at all. I couldn't imagine the buildings and the structure of the town, the wide streets. I didn't know anything about those. She didn't talk so much about those. So that was fresh. And the first time we came was in 1958, soon after my grandmother's death. My mother thought that it was time she took her 2 daughters to Colorado Springs, and at the same time brought out papers, things she wanted to give to the Pioneers Museum. So that was our first trip, and very memorable it was too. We came incognito because my mother was so publicity shy. She didn't like any parties or red carpets and the rest of it. And she didn't want to be hailed as General Palmer's granddaughter. She just wanted to come and see and show us. She didn't actually like the place very much herself. I think perhaps she got a bit impatient with my grandmother talking about it so much and being sort of in her heart, half in America, half in Colorado. But whatever the reason, my aunt has the same attitude. My mother's sister is still alive. She's 83 and not very well. We don't expect her to live very much longer because she has lung cancer. But she also shares this same attitude. And I think that they must have come over in a family party when my mother and aunt were in their teens. And my own private theory, this is not fact, was that they quarrelled the whole time and therefore it had bad associations for them. It was quite an ill-matched family in many ways. My mother and my aunt were close and very fond of each other. My grandfather and my mother were very close. They had a kind of jarring relationship, but they admired each other very much. And my grandmother and my aunt were very close. And so it was a kind of, in a way, a divided family, and sparks flew quite often, I think. So for that reason, there's kind of been a generation of visits to Colorado Springs missed out more or less, except for that one visit, which was very memorable. We stayed in the old Antlers Hotel, or the second Antlers Hotel, which we loved. We really did. It was beautiful, and we very much regret the loss of that. But that's by the way. But one thing that happened while we were there the first time was that somebody sneaked into our rooms. We had adjoining rooms in the Antlers, and stole our purses. And I always remember my mother coming into the adjoining room where Jane and I were, and she said, "Hello, darlings, we've been robbed." She said it in exactly that tone of voice, and we'll never forget that. In fact, it wasn't very serious. My mother had a billfold that belonged to General Palmer with his initials on it, and it contained travellers' cheques. And that was taken. Jane and I had just a few coins in our purses, I think, so really that didn't matter at all. But the wallet was found underneath the mattress of one of the other rooms, a bed in another room in the hotel, so that was recovered. The travellers' checks, well, that was all organised. But the thing is that we had to tell the police, and from then on the cat was out of the bag and everybody knew that General Palmer's granddaughter was in town. So there were great celebrations, which we all enjoyed thoroughly. They were more or less spontaneous, and everybody was delighted to see her. And I was privately glad that happened, because it was a shame really to sneak in and then sneak out again. So that was our first visit. And then our second visit was with my husband Louis. We came together to take part in the celebrations in 1986, the Spirit of Parma Festival. And we weren't prepared for the welcome we'd get. We knew that, I mean, the Americans in England have a reputation for being extremely hospitable and friendly and warm. And we knew this, but we were completely taken aback by the welcome we received and all the events that were fixed up for us. And it was quite like a dream, really. We were going from one place to another, and everybody was so appreciative of General Palmer. This was the heartwarming thing. And before our first visit, not knowing anything much about General Palmer, we boned up about him as far as we could with literature we had in the family, and learned and became very much more interested in him. And then to come here and find that he was alive and well.
That American capitalist railroad builder, as he is described in England.
Yes, yes. But so appreciated, and such a businessman with a difference, as we now know. You know, such a generosity of spirit.
Do you recall any photographs or any stories that quickened your imagination as a child? Any that you lingered over and looked at and wondered about or asked questions about that were in the family?
Well, there was his watch, a beautiful watch that chimed and was inscribed on various faces of it. We were fascinated by that. And my grandmother used to show this to us quite often and let us listen to the chimes. And she described the way it was lost in the snow. And it belonged to General Palmer. It was given to him. It is in Colorado Springs. I can't remember the inscriptions. But it was a very highly treasured watch. And he lost it in the snow on the mountains. And he was very, very sad about this. And then there was one of the children at Glenari had measles and was just recovering and went for a bit of a stroll. And he found the watch, he or she, I don't know, found the watch and brought it back to him. And he was so delighted, and he tested the chime, and sure enough it was still chiming, and there was nothing wrong with it at all. So that was one of the stories that we enjoyed, that she told us. But otherwise, I don't think there were any specific stories, just descriptions. She used to read to us a lot. She read some beautiful stories about, well, one was called Princess and the Curdie. That's the one that sticks in my mind. The Princess and Curdie by MacDonald. And we would come eagerly back for the next reading. She'd sometimes read 2 or 3 times a day. And another thing about my grandmother, which isn't perhaps generally appreciated, is that she was very, very musical, and she played the piano beautifully. When she was at Glenari, she used to go to Denver quite regularly for piano lessons. And my mother and my aunt remember her practicing at night, and their room was above, and they would listen to this lovely music coming up through the floorboards. And they both developed a great love for the piano, particularly my mother, and it really was a very important childhood memory of both of them. She had lessons with quite grand people in England. She never was a performer. She hadn't the nature. She had the ability, but she didn't have the nature to perform in public. But she played to friends, and her grandchildren, at least 3 of them, were very musical. And we always used to play her our latest piece that we'd learnt on the piano as children. And she was very encouraging, and we enjoyed her very much as a person. She was not fierce at all. Some old people seem to, young ones, very fierce. She was extremely gentle and loving, and just a little bit pathetic because she couldn't get around properly and she couldn't see. She had 3 servants when we knew her, still, from having had many before, but these were kind of old retainers who stayed with her to the end. She had a housekeeper, a Scottish housekeeper, who was fierce. We were quite frightened of her. And a very gentle nurse, a personal maid, and also a cook, a very good cook. And we used to really enjoy our Christmases there. And one of my regrets is that when I got older, into my teens, and I wasn't with my mother all the time, I didn't go up and visit her. She lived some way from London, quite a long way northeast, in East Anglia in England, near Ipswich. And so it was a bit of a journey in those days. And it's a great pity I didn't get to know her out of the family context as person to person, because I know now that I would have enjoyed that very much and learnt more about her time in Colorado and in England, because they lived for some time in a very well-known National Trust property called Ightham Moat. It's only recently been taken over by the National Trust. But it's a very beautiful, old building, manor house, surrounded by water. Moat is actually spelt M-O-T-E, but it does have a M-O-A-T. And we've been to visit it since it's belonged to the National Trust. And it's a building that they were extremely fond of. Nobody seems to know how long they were there, or if they were there the whole year round, or just took it for the summer. But it played a big part in their life, in their lives. And it was there that John Singer Sargent painted the portrait of Elsie that hangs in the Fine Arts Centre. And we've been there and we've seen the linen fold panelling, which forms the background of the painting.
And they lived in another house, an Elizabethan house, and...
Well, this was the Elizabethan house. I think there was...
Oh, I thought this was...
There was another house, can't remember the name of it, where they make the yoghurt now.
Loseley Hall.
Loseley Hall, yes, and that was a big house as well. But then they moved, and they didn't mind moving, but it was when the silver crash came in Colorado Springs and in Colorado, and they all had to draw in their horns a bit. And so they moved into a little cottage in Kent. Also, they were very fond of that. I mean, it wasn't a tiny cottage. It was what we would call a house now, but it was very, very reduced.
And that was Frant?
Frant, yes. Frant.
Yes, in Frant. Well. That's right, yes. But we don't know very much about that time, except that Queen was a bosom friend of Ellen Terry, who's a very well-known English actress. And we found a lot of notes from Ellen Terry, very hastily scrawled actressy notes, saying, do come, I've got a box for you, come and see Othello or whatever. I'll see you afterwards. And little emotional notes, because Ellen Terry had a lot of ups and downs in her life and so on. And I think possibly they went to Ightham Moat to be near her. She lived at Small Hythe, which isn't very far away. It's also in Kent. And I think they probably got together, you know, between when they were both there quite often. And there's a little museum at Small Hythe. And we took some of these letters, some of this correspondence between the two there.
So the John Singer Sargent portrait of Elsie must have been done actually when she was, it's called Portrait of a Young Girl, isn't it?
Yes.
So it would be about, she might have been about 14 or 15 years old. We have varying stories about whether she was 18 or 14 or 15.
Yes, I can't get this quite clear, but I think she was about 17, but That again is for the historians to calculate.
And were you aware that when it was finally came home, I think they had the Fine Arts Center had a mass effort called Bring Elsie Home to Colorado Springs, and then purchased the painting from the Buffalo Art Museum. That was in about 1969. Were you aware of that? And then I think the headline in the paper was Elsie Comes Home. And it was
this was
a wonderful community event.
Yes. Well, we heard about it afterwards, of course, and we're delighted that she did come home. But we were unaware of anything because we were completely out of touch, you see. The only way that we kept in touch at all was through my mother and Rhoda Wilcox having a correspondence. And really, my mother was no correspondent, so really the credit for it has to go to Rhoda Wilcox entirely, because she faithfully kept the correspondence, wrote at Christmas, sent a copy of her book, Man on the Iron Horse, and told my mother about the festival in 1986, the Palmer Festival. And my mother thought, well, there better be a representative of the family going out for that. So she decided that Paul should go. And Paul is my eldest sister's oldest son, Paul Casmin. And so that was all arranged before we knew about it. And Paul came out with his mother, Jane. And they came out before we did. And then we decided, well, we wanted to come too. In fact, we'd had arranged to before Jane did. And so there were 4 of us that came out for that event, and I'm very glad. It was just a chance word from my mother. She said, oh, by the way, did you know there was this? And of course we had no means of knowing about this festival.
Well, your mother was incredibly generous. When you look at papers and at photographs, really our only knowledge of Queen Palmer and Dorothy and Marjorie comes essentially from papers that and photographs that your mother has given. So we're enormously grateful to her for her sense of history and her sense of believing that it belongs in Colorado. And
yes, she was. She did have that about her. She did want the things to come back. So although she didn't want to come herself after our visit together, she really felt that things should be in their right place, and if Colorado Springs appreciated these things, and then Colorado Springs should have them. That was her feeling.
I know there's always been an eagerness to find a portrait of Queen as well as a portrait of Elsie, and so far the attempts have been unsuccessful. But you said that you recently gave another gift to the Fine Arts Center could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this was a painting. It's a painting by my mother. She had, following the exhibition that I've already described of the 4 Nicholsons, she had several other exhibitions, and more paintings were got out and framed. And this was wonderful to us because really she hadn't had recognition while she was doing these paintings and designs earlier. And it was nice before she died that she should have recognition, and she got a good deal of it in her last 3 or 4 years. Well, then it was really Louis who had the idea that she should donate one of her paintings to the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center, because he felt that as Elsie was there, it would be interesting to have a work of her daughter. So they chose a very nice subject, one of our favorites actually. It was a string bag. And there's a very nice, clever drawing. Well, it's mainly drawing, but with some colour, of this old string bag, which is now in the Fine Arts Centre.
When you think about the 4 generations of women, beginning with Queen, and then Elsie, and then EQ, and then yourself, what qualities, what characteristics would you say identify you as women?
That's very difficult. I should think we're all artistic. That's one thing, because although Elsie didn't paint as far as we know, she had a great eye for painters and bought some to our great delight, because we have 1 or 2 of them in our home in York, and they were really good paintings that have stood the test of time. and these painters have since become well known. She had a flair for making nice surroundings, lovely homes, artistic homes. My mother very much had this. She always could make anything, any old dump, into a wonderful, light, airy, colourful place. And I think I have it to a certain extent too. I certainly have something of a painter in me, although my artistry comes out in music more. I think I felt there were so many painters in the family that unconsciously I felt I couldn't possibly, too much would be expected of me, and I didn't want to take that on that challenge. So I took to music instead, but I have no regrets at all because the flute has been a wonderful joy to me since I took it up. But apart from that, characteristics, I don't know, because I really don't know Queen well enough. My grandmother was very, very gentle but firm. She knew what she wanted, but she was a gentle person. She would listen to people. She would understand people. My mother was a more jarring sort of personality, very gifted, very strong in her opinions, would be extremely charming, but then she might turn against someone or get very impatient. And well, it's hard to say how I've inherited any of those characteristics, but I don't see a lot of resemblance between my mother and my grandmother, and those are the only two I can really judge at all, and that's very little because I was really a child when I knew Elsie.
Do you recall any stories about Marjorie Palmer or Dorothy Palmer?
Well, I knew Dorothy Palmer quite well, really. We used to see her every year regularly, more often, usually, but we had what we called the ADT each year, and this was the Auntie Doss treat. We used to call her Auntie Doss, and she used to take us out, all 5 grandchildren, all 5 of that generation, the 3 of us and my 2 cousins. She used to take us for a treat each year after Christmas when everything was a bit flat. She used to take us to the Café Royal, which was an extremely posh cafe and restaurant in London. And I still remember sitting on these red plush seats with this kind of hushed atmosphere and the white napkins. And to end our meal, she always gave us creme de menthe because we thought the colour was so beautiful. And so in a slightly tipsy state, we would then go off to the pantomime or whatever she chose to take us to that year. And she was a tiny little lady when we knew her. She seemed very tiny, even to children, very thin, but very, very beautiful. She would wear mainly black velvet in my memory, and with a black velvet hat with a little veil over it. And you'd see these large eyes peering through the veil. And very gently spoken. A black velvet coat, very, very smart, and fun too. We liked her very much. She wasn't at all frightening as other great aunts have been in my life on the other side of the family. She was extremely gentle and, again, a listening sort of person, rather like her sister. Some people listen and others give out. And she was, well, in a way, listening is giving out, but you know what I mean. Some people have more forceful personalities. She was genuinely interested in each of her grandchildren and loved giving them this treat.
And she was primarily what we would now call a social worker. She was engaged in...
Yes, she was. We weren't aware of any of that at our age. She was already getting on a bit when we became aware of her. But she helped people a lot, and she often had people under her roof that she was helping, nursing. She was very kind. And she and her sister got on Elsie very well. Auntie Doss lived in Chelsea, and Elsie, as I've said, lived in Suffolk in East Anglia. And they used to telephone each other every day, taking in turns. One would have the odd days and the other would have the even days. And they would usually have conversations about their health, I remember. They were very, very concerned for each other's health all the time. And another thing I remember about Elsie was that she listened religiously to Letters from America, Alistair Cook, every Sunday morning. And I remember hearing this voice, and there was a kind of hushed atmosphere while she was listening. We weren't allowed in the room really then, the noisy children. But generally speaking, we were playing in the room with her a lot, and she loved to have us around. But it was interesting that she was listening to America a lot, and she kept up with the politics and everything to do with America, and probably a lot of her American friends. She had very, very close friends, very good friends. That I do remember about her. Old family friends. She wasn't the sort of person to have... She was a very private person, really. Her friends were very deep. Her friendships went deep. Not so many of them, but very close. And I think probably my Auntie Doss was the same. Marjorie, I'm afraid I don't remember at all because she died so early. I don't even really remember any stories about her.
Dorothy and Elsie lived to be into their 80s, so they lived quite long. And
yes, they did. But of course I didn't know them in their latter years at all, because I was too interested in my own life by then.
yes, that's one of the problems. We think that you must have spent all your holidays and evenings discussing Colorado Springs and General Palmer, where that was probably the very least of your concerns.
It hardly entered our consciousness at all, unfortunately. But we are very delighted to have made acquaintance with Colorado Springs and all the delightful inhabitants that we've met. It's a great pleasure to us and an expanding of our lives. We really feel it's given us a great deal coming here. This is our 4th visit together with my husband. And we're very, very grateful to everybody for extending such warmth and friendship towards us. It means a great deal to us.
We're always very curious about the name Queen Palmer. We know that her name was Mary Lincoln Mellon, eventually Palmer. Do you know anything about the origins of the name Queen, whether that was...
Well, at first we thought it was General Palmer's nickname for her, which stuck generally and probably suited her quite well. And he had his queen to put in his castle that he'd built and so on. But recently, Lewis and I came across an old piece of dictation done by Queen when she was very young indeed, maybe 7 or 8. And on it said Queen Mellon. So we know from that she was in fact called Queen. She may have dropped the name, but she was called Queen as a child and called herself Queen. So this does seem to prove that she's been Queen all along.
We're also very struck by Queen's contribution to the history and culture of Colorado Springs, even though she was actually here such a short period of time. She seems to have been very individualistic, very concerned, very true to her own nature and her feeling for art and for music. Do you see that as a thread that runs through the women in your family, your aunts and your grandmother?
Yes, I think so. I think they've all had this firmness and strength and individuality. And I think for Queen we don't know exactly all the reasons for her leaving Glenari, but we know that there was one reason which was sufficient by itself, and that is that she simply couldn't stand the altitude. But we think she had a nature that was craving this artistic stimulation. But she simply couldn't get out in the West. So that was another very big reason. and also that General Palmer was so busy with all his, it's incredible what he did in quite a short time, how he could have had a lot of time at home is difficult to imagine. I think they probably stayed devoted to each other because he did go over to England so often, and it was such a journey, and he had such pressing things here in Colorado Springs. But why she went quite so far away, we don't really know, except that she did have friends in England, and she maybe wanted to make a life for herself that was independent of General Palmer's life, which again is understandable. He was such a great figure, and she needed to find expression for her own gifts, which she did, and she also wanted to bring up the children in that kind of atmosphere of culture, and they all were very artistic, I believe, and she herself painted. We don't know any of her paintings. I don't know if anybody does, but apparently she did paint a lot in the tower room at Glenari. It may have been partly a retreat. She may have needed solitude, and there were the house was overrun with melon children at the time, so that could have been partly it, but partly she may have needed a kind of silence and a time to charge her batteries. She wasn't very well, and this is certainly something that's come out in me. I need a time to myself. I need a time to do what I want to do each day, and I'm really quite selfish about it. It takes the form either of practicing the flute. I really am quite, I really tell my husband off if he interrupts me. I need that time. I need that time to do what I want to do, what I feel that I'm here on this earth to do. And so I can very well understand if Queen had those feelings as well. And she certainly did make for herself a creative life, even if there isn't anything that we have to show for it at the end, like paintings or artistic things. But she was very, very interested in the theatre. And I've already mentioned her relationship with Ellen Terry. She loved Wagner operas, and this she passed on to her children. They saw a lot of performances of The Ring, and they probably even went to Bayreuth to see. I don't know about that, that's conjecture, but they were imbued with this love of Wagner operas, which I must say I don't share, nor did my mother, but that's a passion that they had. And in some of the correspondence, the young girls were enthusing to German nannies about how wonderful certain performances of Wagner operas have been in New York they'd seen.
Well, one of the cherished legends of the founding of Colorado Springs is that in January of 1872, Queen and Rose Kingsley and Maurice Kingsley gave a concert to raise money for the reading room or the library, and that she sang 2 Verdi operas. And so that is a story that's very near and dear to our hearts, when there were 1,200 people in some wooden buildings, and in the midst of a terrible storm, Queen was raising money for our reading room by singing.
Yes, that's a lovely story, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And you yourself are an accomplished flautist, and we wondered if we could impose upon you to play for us today. Would that be?
Well, I'll tell you first, I really didn't intend to bring my flute to the States this time, because I really needed a rest from it, because I've been playing so much and teaching so much in York. But I went the day before we came here. I ended a course. I participated in a course in the North Yorkshire moors near our home, a flute course. And I was so inspired, and they gave me new techniques to learn. One goes on learning always with the flute. I mean, I've been teaching for years, but there's still much more to learn. And so I've been trying, while here, to practice each day on a new breathing technique, which won't come out today because it isn't enough part of me yet. But this has been very interesting, because I want to get it established before I get back to England and start teaching again. But this piece that I'm going to play is a very well-known piece for solo flute, unaccompanied flute, and it's called Syrinx by Debussy. It has a little tale behind it, and the tale is that Syrinx is a Greek nymph, and she was being amorously pursued by Pan. She didn't want any of his attention, so she decided to run away. And she ran. She could run very well, but the trouble was that when she came to a river, she couldn't swim. So she asked the nymphs of the river to help her. And Pan was coming over the mountains and catching up with her. So they had to think quickly, and they changed her into a reed. And Pan could see the reed, and he kept his eye on it, and he plucked it, and he fashioned it into a flute. And according to Mr. Debussy, this is what he played.